Hello, I'm Chuck Bentley. I'm the CEO of Crown Financial Ministries. We're going to talk today about the inflation survival guide that I put together to respond to a number of questions that we keep getting at the ministry. By the way, if you want to know more about our ministry, you can learn who we are and what we do and find free resources at crown.org. Now, inflation has hit all of us, whether you're in the United States or any other part of the world. It's a global phenomenon right now. And there is an obvious need to know how to navigate it. I'm going to talk about what is inflation, where does it come from, how it can be contained, how long does it last, some of those basic questions. And then I'm going to go into some very practical tips. So just stay with me as we go through this teaching today, and hopefully you'll get some answers to the questions that are on your mind and help you to navigate these very, very challenging times. You know, I was watching an interview just recently with Charlie Munger, and he was talking about the dangers of long-term inflation. And he had a quote, and this is not exactly the way he said it, but essentially his point was this, that outside of nuclear war, inflation is one of the greatest threats in the world that we face right now. Now, the reason I took such note of Charlie Munger's statement, and I tend to agree with him, by the way, is that he's one of the world's greatest investors. Charlie Munger is Warren Buffett's partner, longtime partner. And so he's making statements that identify the risk that he sees on the horizon. And he also said in that interview something very, very important, that he sees the value of the U.S. dollar going to zero within the next 100 years. And so when people like Charlie Munger are talking about the threats of inflation, I think that we as Christians need to be informed and know what we need to do to respond to it. So what is inflation? Well, it's simply an economic condition when there's more money than goods. Goods are in short supply and money is in oversupply. So the cost of goods begin to rise. Another way to look at inflation is to define it as the loss of purchasing power. Some have said it is a form of silent theft. Now, what they mean by that is if you have money sitting in a bank right now, you're losing money. It's eroding. It's going away. Let me give you a visual example that really I think we can all relate to. I have a certain type of little protein bar that I like to buy at the store. And it's, about 5 inches or 6 inches long. And over the last few months, that bar has shrunk inside the packaging by about 20%. The packaging is still the same size, but the content inside of it is shrinking. And I can't really see it until after I've purchased it. Also, this bag of chips I recently bought. The chip is, filled with air, this packaging. And when I opened it, there was less than 40% of the content of that bag that actually had chips in it. The other 60% was made of air. Well, the exact same thing is happening in your bank account. Your money is losing value right now. That's inflation. Now, what causes inflation? As I said, supply chain disruptions happen. Fiscal policy causes supply chain disruption, monetary policy, and too much money in the economy. By the way, monetary policy is the amount of money that's being printed or made available in the economy, as well as interest rates. Those are controlled typically by central banks, by the Federal Reserve. Fiscal policy is the amount of money the government is spending and the amount of debt they're creating and the amount of taxes that they levy on people to run the government. And then, of course, supply chain disruptions that we all know are happening. This is as a result of many of the things that happened during COVID. Now, where are we right now? We're in all of these. All of these things are converging at the same time. This is a classic case of the factors that go into inflation and cause it to be very painful and acute right now. If you look at this graph from the Federal Reserve Bank, the U.S. money supply has increased exponentially just since the great financial crisis. you see it's actually an unprecedented rise in the amount of money that's being pumped into the economy. This is inflationary. And this is a problem that we have to monitor because we're not sure if and when they're going to stop doing this. If you ask the question, how is this going to be contained? Well, you have to look at the same things that causes it. Monetary policy. When will money printing slow down? When will interest rates rise? Interest rates tend to have a leveling effect on economic growth and on inflationary growth. Also, fiscal policy. When will the government begin to make wise decisions and become better stewards? Stop overspending, stop creating massive debt, and stop increasing taxes. And when will economic growth begin to allow more goods into the market to equalize the amount of money in the market? Business growth is very, very important. And so all of these factors make it a complex issue. And I think in our case, when the supply chain begins to stabilize, when we begin to get more goods available for purchase, then you're going to see inflation somewhat contained. One of the examples I like to give is that we buy used cars. I bought a used car in 2018 prior to COVID. As you know, the microchips that go in new cars are in short supply right now. So new car inventory is very, very low. That means that the price of used cars, which are more available than new right now, has skyrocketed. The used car that I bought in 2018, at that time, it was 6 years old. Today, it would be 10 years old. That used car that was once $7,000 is now nearly $14,000. That's inflationary. You see it at the gas pump. You see it in the grocery store. You see it in the cost of airline tickets. We're living in a time of great inflation. Hopefully, the supply chain will open up soon and start to stabilize or bring these prices back down. Another question I get asked is, how long does inflation last? That's a really good question because the real answer is it never goes away. If you look at this graph from 1913 to 2015, it's just continuing up and to the right. So an example here is if you purchase something for $1 in 1913, that same item would cost $2,326 today. That's the constant rise of inflation. Now, as of March 2022, inflation was estimated to be at 8.5%. That's the rate of inflation right now. Now, of course, this varies by countries. It's different in many countries of the world. I think Zimbabwe and Venezuela have the highest inflation rates in the world right now. This is the inflation rate for the United States. If you look at some of the historic periods of inflation, we've always had it, as I said. Sometimes it's worse than others. About the only time we had deflation or negative price increases was during the Great Depression, during the 1930s, 1939. You see on my graph, prices actually collapsed and went backwards at the rate of about 18%. But ever since then, you see periods of significant inflation. So far, our inflation rate is not out of control, and we're hoping that it's soon going to be contained. But let me speak to it from a biblical perspective. One of the things that I like to refer to is the wisdom of God when it comes to these economic phenomenons. And the Bible speaks to every one of them. There is no circumstance that's not covered by some story or parable or principle in the Scripture. I'm thinking of 2 Kings chapter 6. In 2 Kings chapter 6, it's a period of what I would call hyperinflation. And two things happened to the Israelites. Number one, they were in a famine. And famine means food is in very, very short supply. It's in a critical shortage. But then that was combined with a secondary factor, and that was war. as you see what's happening in the Ukraine right now or what's happening in Afghanistan. They're experiencing terrible, terrible inflation and shortage of food and shortage of essentials. Well, this was happening to the Israelites. They were surrounded and shut off from their supply chain, and what they had left was not much to live on. And so it's the story of the donkey's head. Now, that's not something that's very desirable in most people's menu. But a donkey's head was selling for a significant amount of money. Even seed pods were selling for a very, very high price. And that is when the king said that he needed God's help. He couldn't solve the problem. There was cannibalism going on. Inflation was so bad. And during that story and illustration, we see that God miraculously opened the supply chain by ending the war. And if you remember the story, the lepers were able to go out and plunder those soldiers who fled, leaving all their possessions behind. And inflation decreased overnight, which seemed impossible, but it was possible. And we learn lessons during these stories that God shares with us of how he can regulate the economy. In fact, he says in Haggai, if you look at the verse there, in Haggai 1, 6, and 7, that there are times that because of our immorality and disobedience to the Lord, that we are earning wages, putting them in a bag with holes in them. I think he's referring to inflation, a time when no matter how hard we work, what we have is going backwards in value. The Lord speaks to that. He also speaks to the unrighteousness of rulers who bring about inflation by having unequal weights. And as you know, it truly is immoral for a governing body to bring inflation on the people for the benefit of the government. It's essentially robbing the savers so that debt can be paid off more cheaply by governing bodies. And so these principles and examples are all throughout Scripture. I just wanted to give you some of them to think about it in a different context, because we're not alone. We're not without ways to understand it and without God's help in any time that we're suffering through a season like this. God's design for the economy. How does God intend for the economy to work? And then I'm going to get into some of the tips that will help you regardless of where you are today. A healthy economy starts with work. God worked. The Scripture says he worked for 6 days. It's an amazing thought. And since we're created in his image, we were put here to also work. And when we work, God provides. The second thing God said that we should do with money in a healthy economy is to give first. Giving is our highest priority with money, no matter what God provides, whether it's a lot or a little. We're created in his image to be givers. After we give, we are to save. Saving is a form of constraint to our desires and consumption. Saving is a sign of wisdom. It's a sign that we're not out of control, that the fruit of the Spirit, which is self-control, is evident in our life. I like to say one of the best things you can do for your personal economy is to work, give first, and save second. Now, if you do those three things, you're going to be better off than most other people. You're going to be demonstrating the wisdom of God's economy. Now, after you've done 1, 2, and 3 in this economic cycle, the next thing you need to do is to spend, and to spend wisely. There's a saying that says if you begin to buy things that you don't need, one day you'll have to sell things that you do need. And so we show God's wisdom by the way we spend money. In fact, if you're a good spender, all these other things will come into play because you will have margin in order to do these things. After you've spent wisely and with constraint, then you have surplus. And in that surplus, you can invest. And when you invest, you help to create jobs so that people can work. Now, look at that wheel. To navigate inflation successfully right now, every part of that wheel needs to be turning in your life, in your personal economy, in your microeconomy. That wheel needs to spin. That is a wheel of economic sustainability. If any of those parts break down, then your personal economy will be impacted, but so will the macroeconomy. The more people that are working in any culture, in any nation of the world, the better off the economy. And for those who can't work, they become the beneficiaries of your charity, of your willingness to share with others. That's why God established it as a high priority. Some people cannot work. They're unable to, and the Bible talks about categories of people that we should be helping charitably that are unable to work. And then when you save, you minimize the fear of economic circumstances. You're prepared. You set aside in the good days, like the ant, so that you could be helpful to others and endure the times when there might be a lack. You gather and harvest, and you've stored for the winter. In fact, it's an interesting phenomenon that cultures that have strong winters have the highest savings rate in the world. Cultures that live near the equator, where there's very little change in the climate and they have warm temperatures year-round, have the lowest savings rate in the world. They're not prepared for uncertainty. And then after you've saved, you spend wisely, and then you can invest. All right, so let's give you some practical tips on things that will help you get through this time of inflation right now. The first tip is related to work. So we're going to go around this cycle. What do you need to be thinking about in regard to your work? First of all, determine if you work for an organization that's benefiting from inflation. Now, there's a number of industries that are benefiting. Those are industries that can pass along the cost to the consumer. Have you bought an airline ticket lately? It is extraordinarily more expensive to fly right now. The demand is great. There's a pent-up demand because of 2 years of no travel. Prices are increasing because of the price of oil and gas. And so it's very, very expensive. If you work for an airline, they're an industry benefiting from inflation. Now, if you do, then you need to add value to your employer. And if you're adding value, then you have job security. And at the appropriate time, you can wisely ask for a raise so that your personal economy keeps up with inflation. But on the other hand, if you work for an organization that's getting hurt by inflation, and if inflation persists, you need to realize the potential impact on your future employment. Your employer may have to go through a layoff. They may have to decrease your hours. They may have to decrease your income. They may have to adjust your benefits. So make an analysis. Are you in an industry that's benefiting or getting hurt? If you're getting hurt by inflation, your employer's getting hurt by inflation, then you need to take the advice of Solomon in Ecclesiastes 11:6. In that verse, he talks about the uncertainty of our economic future, and that having two sources of income is one way to mitigate your risk. I think that's true. He said, do something by day and something by the evening, because you don't know which one will succeed, and you don't know what disaster may be coming. So diversify your sources of income when you work. That is a great strategy to hedge against inflation. And there's lots of ways to do it, especially with the online economy, especially with the gig economy, especially with the need for labor right now. I once worked with a church that was trying to buy a building debt-free. And they challenged everyone in the congregation to take on a second source of income for 1 year, contribute those funds so that they could buy this building debt-free. You know what happened? People started discovering gifts they never knew they had. Maybe mothers started baking something and selling to their neighbors their favorite recipe. Children started offering to clean up yards or garages or to help do projects for other people. There were just some wonderful stories of things that people did out of their own creativity where God provided income. And after that 1 year, many of those people continued that side gig which became a part of their career. It became a part of how their family was then sustained through some difficult economic times. When you go around this wheel, you look at giving. During a time of inflation, I believe you need to continually, faithfully honoring the Lord with your giving. It's tempting to pull back. It's tempting to think that maybe that's the first thing you need to stop doing. But in fact, investing in God's kingdom is the only guaranteed return of anything that we do with money. The Bible says that we store up for ourselves treasures in heaven. And I don't think there's ever any reason to stop doing that. We honor the Lord by saying, you're our provider. You provide 100% of what we have. Therefore, we're going to make you our priority. I want you to also remember that right now, charitable organizations have very little way to pass on inflationary cost or to absorb those. They're very vulnerable right now. Your church, your favorite charity, they need you to keep that in mind. You may need to actually increase your giving during an inflationary time to your church and charitable favorite charity so that they can ride out the challenges of inflation. When it comes to saving, you need to look for ways to get some sort of safe, modest return on money that you've got parked somewhere. Consider laddering CDs. That means that you buy different maturity terms on certificates of deposits and try to get an average rate that's better than just picking a long-term or a short-term rate. You stagger it or diversify it over time. That means if you purchased a CD at a very, very low rate for 6 months, when it comes due, when you roll that amount back into the next certificate of deposit, maybe a longer term rate, then the interest rates have risen and you can take advantage of that. It's a concept you can look up online, but it helps you to get something for the money you have parked for very low risk. You also need to get creative, looking at online banks, credit unions, or local banks that are offering better rates. You truly do need to try to keep up with your loss of their purchasing power by money you have saved. And then minimize what you have in saving that's not getting any return whatsoever. That's the money that's actually getting hurt and you're not realizing it. So think about what you have in savings, particularly related to short-term inflation. Now, next, think about spending in regard to inflation. Here's a very simple practical tip. If the inflation rate is 8.5%, depending on who you ask, some think it's maybe 14%, and we're just not really getting the full picture. But let's say that it's 8.5%. You need to make an 8.5% adjustment in your budget, meaning reduce your spending in the categories that are non-essential so that you have that 8.5% inflationary cost available to purchase the essentials. Now, as a matter of just general thinking, it's best to convert cash to useful household economies quickly. If prices are rising, then you need to purchase those essentials sooner than later. In times when inflation is out of control, the very best thing you can do is to convert your cash, go to the place to get your essentials, and to do it almost immediately. Manage them carefully. Groceries are rising. Gasoline prices are rising. The cost of vehicles are rising. Rent is rising. So look at your spending and your budget and make projections and adjustments so that you can keep up. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself coming up short month after month after month. Now, investing is one of the best ways to keep up with what you're losing in your household budget due to inflation. Some assets tend to improve because of inflation. Let me give you an example of how you can think about this differently. If you go to the gas pump and the price of gasoline has doubled, well, guess what's happened to the stocks of those companies who sell oil and gas? Most of them have doubled as well. So if you were rotating some of your retirement funds, some of your investable income into oil and gas companies, that growth in that stock has offset your loss of what you're paying for gasoline. Same with companies that sell groceries. Their stock is doing better. The same with companies that are involved in real estate. The price of real estate is going up exponentially all across the United States. But if you're investing in those type of organizations, then you're going to benefit from inflation as opposed to simply get hurt by it. So real estate goes up, commodities go up, energy, steel, gold. Companies that benefit from inflation, these are common sense decisions. People that sell food, airlines, as I just said earlier. And you need to think about diversification. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 11:2, to divide your investments into 7 or 8 different asset classes. He didn't say asset classes, but different forms of investment. That means 12 to 15%. So don't go out and buy all gold and speculate that gold is going to be the only thing that benefits from inflation. You would never want to do that. I think Warren Buffett said you never test the depth of a flowing river with both feet. You just put one foot in at a time. That's wisdom. And so you seek wise counsel and you diversify your investments. Also, I think you do need to consider diversifying a small amount into cryptocurrencies. Now, it's extremely volatile. Be very, very careful. And when I say small amount, something that you could actually afford to lose. Savings should be money that's not at risk of loss. There's a huge difference between saving and investing. Investing is money that by definition has to have some risk associated with it so that it can increase in value. And so you have to manage your investments well and to be very cautious because you're at risk of losing it all. And of course, avoid this attitude that you're going to get rich quick. Many people start buying lottery tickets due to inflationary pressure, thinking that somehow luck is going to provide for them. Can I just say that's one of the worst strategies you could have? That's not how you hedge against inflation. God doesn't use chance and gambling in order to provide for us. He wants to provide for us through wisdom, through careful, measured investment decisions, relying on Him and relying on the truth of His timeless principles. Now, long-term inflation is a threat. And when long-term inflation starts to happen, I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of what I've learned from traveling to countries where long-term inflation was underway. And many of you who are watching this may be living in countries where you're having to deal with that day by day. The first tip is to put as much money to work as possible, meaning don't sit still with any money that you may have. It's going to go quickly to very, very low value. And so you want to convert it into essentials as quickly as possible. And so understand the inflation rate, and that will give you some idea of how quickly you need to convert out of cash into essentials. Buy bulk. You know, if you buy as much as you can, let's say 1 month's supply, then you're going to benefit from inflation. If you buy a month of food at a time, as opposed to maybe you're in the habit of buying food weekly, think about that. If you buy a month's supply of food, you're much better off than buying a week's supply of food because next week it's going to be more expensive. So try to have a longer term view of how you spend money. Buy a month's supply of food. One of the people that I know and have talked with about inflation lived in a country in Latin America where they were expecting potentially 40 or 50% inflation rate that was coming very, very soon. They knew it was going to happen. And so these people decided that the number one essential in their economy at that time would be gasoline. And so they began to get all the containers that they could and go and buy up gasoline, 55-gallon drums of it, in fact. And they started purchasing huge supplies of it, and they would store that. They drained their swimming pool and would store those barrels and barrels and barrels of oil inside this empty swimming pool. Well, little did they know that the inflation rate actually wasn't going to stop at 50%. It soared to 3,000%. And what that meant is every gallon of gasoline that they had purchased in advance went up 3,000%. Not only did people not have to stand in long lines and queues at the gas station to buy an essential need of gasoline, these people are actually able to sell it at a discount to their friends and neighbors and people in their church because they had been wise to convert cash to an essential. Also, publicly traded stocks tend to benefit from inflation. They're already diversified. Most large companies are selling in markets around the world. They're selling a product or service that's used by many, many different people. And they're liquid, meaning you can sell them as you have need. I've never really thought about the benefit of a stock that's traded publicly as one of the best hedges against inflation, but in many ways it is. For instance, it's one thing to own gold that you hold in your hand. It's another to own a company that benefits from the price of gold. Gold mining stocks tend to go up as the price of gold goes up. And it's much more liquid, so you can buy it and sell it as you have need. Also, be informed of the risk of hyperinflation. And that's when the wheels come off. That's when inflationary controls are not working. It's usually at a time with excessive debt, excessive money printing, combined with political instability. When those two factors converge, then you're going to see hyperinflation. I've seen it. We've seen our friends involved with our ministry in Venezuela suffer terribly from hyperinflation. We've seen it recently with people in Afghanistan, in the Ukraine. We're seeing it in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had 2 million% inflation. When I was there, I was able to pick up the Zimbabwe currency, the Zim dollars that were blowing on the ground. They were so worthless that people didn't even bother to pick them up. I own a $100 trillion Zim note. It expired in 2008. It was worthless before it expired, and it has become a collectible form of currency because it's the highest note ever officially printed in the world. The interesting thing is that debt on real estate becomes an asset during hyperinflation because whatever debt you had created during a time of low valuation on the currency, that debt is very, very easy to pay off when the currency spirals into these crazy, crazy numbers. So basically, hyperinflation turns an economy upside down, and you need to be informed and aware of that. So that's what I wanted to share today on the Inflation Survival Guide. We continually put out resources to help people understand how to navigate challenging times. You can learn more about what we're thinking on inflation on a daily basis by tuning into our radio program, subscribing to our Crown Stewardship podcast, subscribing to our Crown newsletter, or just going online to crown.org. I hope this has been helpful to you. Pray that inflation comes under control soon and that you're prepared whatever may come. God bless you. Thanks for joining us today.